Now let me have a closer look at our text here, at our string, which we're combining from a couple of substrings. Now for one, I mentioned that you can use single or double quotes, and the decision is really up to you. You can go for either of the two solutions. I will use single quotes throughout the course, but that's just my personal preference, not something you have to use. However, you should be consistent and stick to your choice thereafter. What you can't do is mix your characters. So you can't open a string with a double quote and try to close it with a single quote. This will not work. You always have to close a string with the character, so with double quote or single quote, with which you opened it. So this string here, for example, is opened with a double quote, and then I have no other double quote, therefore this string never gets closed. That actually, therefore, is invalid JavaScript code, and hence my IDE already complains here that this is an unterminated string literal, so that this string has no end. And if we would try to run this code and reload our page, indeed, if you look into the developer tools again, you'll get an error. Now, the interesting thing actually is if I do close it with a double quote, now everything in between will be treated as one text. So when you open something with single or double quotes, everything in between the opening and closing single or double quotes will be one piece of text, which makes sense if you think about it. How would JavaScript know whether you want to create a new string there? There also is nothing like a string inside of a string. Instead, if we now reload the page, we got rid of our error, but now our whole we want to create a string code is actually treated as one piece of text and therefore output as such here. So you always have to close your string with what you opened it, and everything in between will be treated as text. Now you can take advantage of this if you, for example, want to print this single quote character. Because right now, if I use just single quotes and no double quotes, and the same would be true if you were just using double quotes and no single quotes, if I reload, we get the output we saw before. But what if I actually did want to output a single quote character here? Well, then you could try to add a single quote inside of a single quote, but this won't work. Instead, what now happens is that JavaScript creates a string here and creates a string here, and in between it has this bracket, which actually leads to some invalid JavaScript code overall here, because we're not using any operators that would try to concatenate that. And even if we would, a single opening bracket like this is not valid JavaScript code. So if you want to output the single quote character, you can actually take advantage of the double quotes and, for example, wrap your code, your string that contains the single quote which you want to output, between double quotes. Because now we use double quotes to create the string, everything in between is treated as text, and therefore if we save that and we reload, now we see the single quotes here as well. So that's one way of outputting single quotes if you wanted to. You could deviate from the rule of sticking to either single or double quotes and make an exception if you really want to output the single or double quotes you otherwise use as your string delimiters. Here, of course, I don't really want to print my single quotes, so I don't need to do that. Now we'll dive into strings again and again throughout the course because there are more things you can do with them. One thing I want to do right away is restructure this string. We're building our string here with 3 pieces of text, you could say, with the opening parentheses, with this code thereafter, or with this text thereafter, and with the value that's stored in default result. Now, in such cases, you can actually also use backticks instead of single quotes. So this is now not a single quote, this is the backtick character which you find on your keyboard. Get rid of all other single quotes you actually have, and get rid of these pluses you used to combine your strings, only keep the plus which you want to output on the page, and replace the closing single quote also with a closing backtick or with a backtick. So now I got 2 backticks which surround my text. And therefore now if I save this, unsurprisingly here I say default result instead of the value which is actually stored in that default result constant. But now backticks give you access to a special syntax. You can now use a $sign in here and then an opening and closing curly brace. And now you can put your variable or any expression which yields some result which can be output as text. So you could also have a calculation like 1 + 1 in here. So you can put that between your opening and closing curly braces now. And what this does is it tells JavaScript to output the value that's in this constant, in this case, in this place of your text. So it will not output the $sign or the curly brace. Instead, it will output the value of the expression, as it's called. So in this case, of the constant you have between the opening and closing curly brace. So if you now save that file and you reload, you see 0 here, which indeed is the value we have in default result. This only works with backticks. If you use single or double quotes, this $sign curly brace thing would be treated as regular text and therefore output as such, as you can see. So this is a really nice feature using these backticks with this $sign curly brace thing. If you have some text in which you want to embed or inject some dynamic value, so the result of some calculation or the value that's stored in a variable or of a constant, then this is simply shorter. It saves you the manual string concatenation, which we previously had to do, where we combined multiple strings with the plus operator. This is simply a bit shorter and therefore how you typically would build a string that includes dynamic values. This overall construct here is called a template literal. So if you ever Google for JavaScript template literal, you'll find, well, exactly this piece of syntax. Now there's actually more to it and we'll dive deeper into it throughout this course, but this is the most basic and I would say most important form of using it, because that's the form where you will work with it most often to have some text into which you inject or embed some dynamic value. Now, some additional information about strings and template literals as we have it here. One convenient thing about template literals is that you can easily write multi-line strings there. Now, with multi-line strings, I mean strings which really do have a line break in them. So let's say here, in front of the asterisk character, I add a couple of line breaks and hence this string looks like that. Might look a bit strange at first, but this is valid JavaScript syntax. We open a string here, we close it here, and since it is a template literal with backticks, this is allowed. For a normal string with single or double quotes, this would not be allowed, but I will come back to that. Now, if you save that and you reload this in the browser, you'll not see a difference, though if you have the developer tools opened, which you can always open with View, Developer, Developer Tools, and you then click on this select icon there and you select this part of your web page, you will see that indeed the white space is considered here. It's just the browser and the default behavior of the browser and the h2 element that basically strips this redundant white space. But it's output there, and depending on where you output this, in which element and how that element is styled, you might also get that white space or the extra line break here in your web page. So the fact that we don't see the line break here in the middle is really just due to how this is styled and rendered. If you go down here to the element style of the h2 element, which is selected, and you add white space pre, for example, then you will see the white space here as well, because this is some CSS styling which does not omit the extra white space, but instead render it. Here, in this case, that means it renders this extra line break. So you can easily add line breaks here when using the template literal syntax. This can help you with readability because you might be able to read long strings easier or better here in the IDE if you add line breaks, but you should always keep in mind that this is not just a visual thing for you in the IDE, but that the line breaks really are part of the string. The same is true if you indent this. For example, you could think that if you write it like this, it's a normal string, but it's more readable to you as a developer. Well, if you save that and you reload, our styling will be lost because we reloaded, but here on the right you can see this extra white space, it really is part of the string. And if we re-add this style here to our h2 element here in the developer tools by setting white space to pre, you see we really do have the line break and the extra white space in here. So be careful when you use that and really only use the line break or extra white space feature here if you want to build a string that has the extra white space or that has the line break. Don't do it just for readability. Now, if I come back to normal strings, there, let's say we have an error message, which we don't need for this app, for this website here, but just to demonstrate how we work with normal, which means non-template literal strings. Then, of course, you use singular double quotes, and you might have a message like an error occurred, something like this. If you would want to split this across multiple lines, you have two options. You can close the string here by adding a single quote and then reopen a new one and combine them with a plus and then add a line break. This is valid JavaScript code. You can span expressions that use operators across multiple lines. That would be possible here for mathematical operations, just as it is possible for concatenating strings with the plus operator. And here you can also indent, and if you do this and you would output this somewhere on the web page, this indeed would not include a line break and also not extra white space, because this is really just something we do for us here in the IDE to make this more readable. The string that's getting constructed only consists of these characters between the single quotes. So there's no line break in there, and there is also no extra white space. Now, if you would want to add a real line break here in a string enclosed by single or double quotes, that is possible with a special character or a special combination of characters. You add a backslash and then n. What this will do if it would be rendered to the screen is it will not output backslash n there, but instead it will treat this as a line break. To show this, let's temporarily output the error message here instead of the calculation description. Just temporarily so that we can see that. Now with that, if we reload here, we see an error occurred. And if we go back and add our good old style here to the h2 element right in the developer tools down there by setting white space to pre, you see the line break here as well. And you can also see it here. There is a line break after error. So with this backslash n, you can add a line break in a string no matter if you use single or double quotes. You could also use this here in the template literal, by the way. It's also supported there, but there you don't need it because there you can just add a normal line break, and since you're in a template literal, that will add a line break to the string as well. So there, this is available. Here in a normal string with single or double quotes, you need that backslash n thing. And by the way, using a backslash in a string has a special meaning. It escapes the character that comes after the backslash, which means the character after the backslash is not treated as a normal character with its normal meaning, but instead combined with the backslash, it gets a special meaning. In this case here, we escape the n, and therefore we don't just output an n here, but instead backslash and n combined mean line break. You have more such combinations, and attached you find a list of available shortcuts or combinations here in your strings. One other important combination, for example, is backslash and then a single quote. This is helpful if you want to output a single quote in your string, especially if your string is enclosed by single quotes. Without the backslash, we would have a syntax error here, because what happens is we open a string with a single quote. Here we then close it, and then here in this case we have a redundant single quote that tries to open a new string, which then never gets closed. So we have to tell JavaScript that this single quote should not be used as it normally uses single quotes, i.e. to close that string, but instead that we want to output this single quote here as a normal character in our text. And adding a backslash in front of it escapes the meaning the single quote would otherwise have, and therefore allows us to do that. Of course, an alternative always is to use double quotes to surround the string instead of single quotes. And then you can use single quotes in the double quoted string without issues and without escaping it, because it then won't have that special meaning of finishing your string or of closing your string, because you can only close a string with the character with which you opened it. And since here we opened a string with a double quote character, we can only close it with such, and JavaScript won't interpret a single quote as a please close my string character. Still useful to know that you could escape it like this. By the way, if you want to output a backslash in a string, you need to escape this as well, because otherwise a single backslash always tells JavaScript that the character after the backslash should be considered or should be escaped. So if you want to output just a backslash, you put another backslash in front of it to tell JavaScript, hey, the character after this backslash has a special meaning, and double backslash then effectively tells JavaScript, I want to output a single backslash here as part of my string. So these are some of the useful things that you should know about strings. You will encounter them throughout this course and throughout your career as a developer. You don't need to learn all these things by heart. The attached list of escapable characters might be useful, though backslash n, backslash backslash, and backslash single quote are the most important ones, I would argue, the ones you typically use most often. And being aware of the template literal, that you can interpolate content here, and that you can easily add line breaks and white space in here, that's also something which is good to know, I guess. And with that, I reverted all of that. Again, I'm sending calculation description to output result, and I deleted the extra error message variable because we don't need it here to continue. I just wanted to dive into some of these string specialties and things you should know.